Greetings sailors and welcome to a ship review, and like the last one I am looking at another mid-tier cruiser, and this time it's the Krasny Krim, the tier 5 premium Soviet cruiser, which has a bit of a bad reputation, and I think part of that is the fact that it's a tier 5, and a lot of tier 5 premiums aren't really so much worth having these days as they were once upon a time, just because they get down tiered a lot. But the Krasny Krim itself also has a fair few kind of lackluster stats, but it does have a considerable capacity to be buffed through captain skills, and I'm actually going to, before we do any gameplay or looking over the stats, I'm going to jump into looking at the captain skills because it's really important on this ship. This, alongside maybe the Belfast, is right up there as one of those premiums that absolutely needs its own dedicated captain in order to get the best out of it. I mean, with the Belfast, you know, it's fairly simple in that the regular British cruisers do not need IFHE, but the Belfast does. So it's that one captain skill that means that you need a dedicated Belfast captain. With the Krasny Krim, it's a couple of different skills. And for a tier 5 cruiser, it needs a pretty heavy captain skill investment in order for it to become even halfway decent. So this is why we're getting into the captain skills right out of the gate. Now, I have a 14-point captain on this. Ideally, you would even maybe have a 17-point captain, because even a 14-point captain doesn't quite unlock the full everything of this ship. And the reason why the captain skills are so important is because it has 130mm guns as its main armament, and so that means that a lot of the skills that used to affect up to 6-inch guns and therefore affected a whole slew of cruisers these days only affect really mostly destroyers, but also a couple of the Russian cruisers. So it's tier 3 and tier 4 of the regular Russian cruisers, and then you have this. So the captain skills that I recommend that are just like absolutely vital on this thing, and for which you need, I would say, at least a 14-point captain for it to be halfway decent. Well, starting at the bottom rank, the most important ones: advanced firing training and IFHE. And you need advanced firing training because it really gives you a lot of extra range. The base range is actually not bad considering their 130mm guns, but it's still not a good range. But with AFT, it suddenly jumps up to a point where there are some tier 8 and tier 9 cruisers that this thing beats in terms of its firing range. And on a tier 5 ship, that's not bad. Although that does come with some drawbacks, and we'll get to that when I'm talking about the actual stats. IFHE you're going to need just for the extra damage, because the 130mm HE shells on their own don't have a huge damage capability, so you absolutely need that extra penetration. You're also definitely going to need Demo Expert, because you'll need that extra fire chance. As I've said, the base fire chance isn't that good, and of course that's actually getting decreased a bit by the use of IFHE as well. The other rank 3 captain skill that I would say you definitely need is basic firing training, because then you get the extra 10% reload time. Now, me doing this now, this particular review, is actually after this having been buffed in patch 6.13. The reload speed used to be, I think it was around 10 seconds. It might have been a little bit under 10 seconds. But these days it's a bit faster. It got buffed, and the buff was noticeable, but you still kind of need BFT to then get your damage output out that bit further. Because even with IFHE and AFT and the buffed reload, the base reload of this ship, you do still kind of need BFT to just give it that extra kick. So that's where the 17 points, that's where the next 3 points on this captain are going to. Then the second ranked expert marksman, because you're getting a pretty big benefit out of it with it being 130mm guns, but also, the base traverse speed of these guns is not impressive. It absolutely is not. So it's really making up for a deficiency rather than making the guns super speedy. And then at rank 1, well, either priority target or preventative maintenance, whatever suits you. Once you've gotten up to your 17-point captain, then of course you've got 2 left over. And at that point, I'd probably take Adrenaline Rush as well, just because that's always a handy skill to have. But yeah, it's really down to the captain skills on this ship. You have just this fixed list of skills that you absolutely have to have. And there's not really a lot of variation. I mean, you could drop, IFHE and maybe take... And I've been kicked out. Oh dear. Yeah, the perils of recording, well, even just sitting in the port... I mean, we were just about done with this anyway. But yeah, you could take Concealment Expert, but at Tier 5 it's not really that worth it. And yeah, it's too heavy a sacrifice. So anyway, if you're wondering about this, by the way, I've been having some internet connection issues recently. So yeah, that's been kind of annoying, but my ISP is theoretically on the case. Anyway, so all that said, let's get on to some gameplay. So, as ever, I have 2 reviews for you. Both of them are bottom tier games, which is going to be a fairly frequent occurrence, which is partly why I picked them out. And there's also one other crucial difference. Having talked about captain skills, this first one is without IFHE, and this is actually a 612 game, so this is before the reload buff as well. The second replay is with IFHE, and it is a 613 replay, so it's with the reload buff, so it's the improved version. And you'll notice, I mean, neither of them are particularly spectacular games, but you will notice just how much better it performs with the addition of that one captain skill, and to a lesser extent the improved reload time as well. Anyway, so stats. Let's talk stats. You have 25,100 hit points, which is the second lowest at Tier 5. Only the Königsberg is worse off, so it's not got a huge health pool by any means. I mean, none of the Tier 5 cruisers especially do, but 25,000 is kind of on the low side even so. You don't have any torpedo belt whatsoever. Only a couple of Tier 5 cruisers do, so it's not that unusual. And the actual armour, well, it's a Tier 5 light cruiser, so I don't usually cover the armour in detail on cruisers, but I will say the citadel on this ship is just above the waterline. It protrudes just above the waterline, so you can and will take citadels when you're showing broadsides, and even when you're not, sometimes you'll get overmatched and get citadeled anyway. The actual given armor value is up to 6 to 125 millimeters, but that 125 millimeters is basically an armored bridge, an armored conning tower, so the rest of it's like 25 mil for the most part. The 75 mil belt will give you a bit of protection against, 6-inch AP, but not much else. So overall, yeah, don't expect a lot out of the armour, but it's a Tier 5 cruiser, so you're not going to begin with. As I've said already, the main caliber of the armament is 130 millimeters, so it's the same as the Soviet destroyers and 2 of the other Soviet cruisers. You have 15 guns, some of which are casement mounted and some of which are in turrets, but they don't traverse terribly quickly. And bear in mind that what you're seeing in this game is with the expert thingy, the one that makes the turrets go faster. I was just talking about captain skills and I've forgotten already. So, I mean, the base is 22.5. With that, it gets better. It gets down to 17.1. Expert marksman, there we go. But it feels like it should be a bit better considering that these are not big guns by any means. Having said that though, 22.5 is not monstrously bad at this tier. Obviously the Furataka with its 8-inch guns is way worse. That's over half a minute. But a lot of the other 6-inch gun cruisers are in the kind of low 20s. Omaha's 24 seconds. Let's see, the Kirov actually gets 30. The Kirov's fairly bad. Murmansk gets 24. The Bartin has actually a pretty whippy 15 rather. So there's quite a lot of variation at Tier 5. So considering that you do have these smaller guns, 22.5 as a base does feel pretty harsh. So that's why you definitely need that captain skill to make things better. The base reload these days is 8.1 seconds. With Expert Loader, you can get that down to 7.3. So again, a highly recommended skill, and just that increase in rate of fire is certainly going to be noticeable over the course of a battle. It doesn't sound a lot in of itself, it's less than a second, but over the course of a game, yeah, that is absolutely going to add up to who even knows how many more thousands of points worth of damage. So again, a pretty vital skill. The base range is 14 kilometers, which is it's not that good for its tier. It's definitely below average. There are things with a worse range. The Emerald has 13.6. For attack it is 13.9, so that's slightly worse. Marblehead also has 13.9, but the majority of them have 15 kilometers or better. Now, this is kind of understandable given that these are smaller caliber guns, that it would not have the best range. But of course, this is where AFT comes into play, and with AFT, suddenly you go from 14 to 16.8. And this is the part where you are beating some of the US high-tier cruisers, for instance, and I think maybe some other cruiser lines as well. 16.8 is pretty spectacular for this tier. And I think the only things that really come close, the Königsberg with 16.5 and the Kirov with 16.3. Now, the downside of that is that these are not particularly fast shells, as you are seeing. So you're going to have to give quite a lot of lead with these shells. It's not what you would maybe expect out of Soviet cruiser guns, and it's not really representative of Soviet cruiser guns as a whole. Generally speaking, they have much faster shells than this. They have much shallower arcs, but you know, that does come with an upside of you being able to use island cover to fire over as you can with US cruisers. So that one's kind of swings and roundabouts, but yeah, when you're firing at that max range, it's going to take your shells a while to get there. The dispersion is pretty reasonable for its tier. It's about in line with, I think, what the Königsberg has. The Sigma, I have absolutely no idea, but it's one of these ships where you're just making up for it with a sheer number of guns you have, even though you can only fire about half, I think just about half, maybe a little over half of them, counting the turrets. At any one time, so it's not like you're firing all 15 at once. That actually would be quite spectacular if you could. The shell damage reflects the caliber. 2500 for an AP penetration, for a citadel penetration, 1900 for HE, so it's about what you would expect. Obviously it is the lowest for the tier because it's the smallest caliber of gun on a cruiser for the tier. The base fire chance is also similarly rather lackluster because of the small caliber. It's 8% fire chance, so that's why you need the demo expert skill on there. And velocities I've already covered. Yeah, it's the same for both. I should probably mention that unlike some ships where they have different velocities, although that doesn't tend to be the case on a lot of cruisers. Secondary armament, you've got the twin 100mm mounts, which you actually might notice they're quite prominent. You've got one on the foredeck and two on the aft, and you might at first mistake them for main caliber guns, but they are not in fact main caliber guns, and the one on the front actually is in front of your forward main caliber gun, so it blocks that main caliber gun from firing directly forward. You actually have to be at a slight angle before you can fire that forward turreted gun. So it's a slightly odd setup, but there it is. They fire out to a range of 4 kilometers. HE throwers, completely normal for this tier. Most of them are around about that. They also double up as AA dual purpose guns, but they don't give you a lot of DPS. In terms of AA, tier 5 is kind of unimpressive. Most tier 5 AA is reasonably okay at dealing with tier 4 carriers, okay-ish at dealing with tier 5 carriers, and then completely terrible at dealing with any kind of higher tier planes. Some are worse than others. I mean, the absolute, utter, complete, most garbagest of all of them is the Marblehead, which has like tier 3 AA essentially. The Marblehead has about the same level of AA as, you know, it's not quite as bad as the Arkansas Beta with literally no AA, but it's bad. You have 11 DPS. This is somewhere towards the top, actually, I would say, just in terms of the range and the DPS, but it's definitely not at the top. And there's only maybe one ship at this tier where manual AA is worth it. It is absolutely not a skill you should consider on the Krasny Krim. You've got, with no skills whatsoever, a base DPS of 90, which is your maximum DPS, assuming there's a plane right overhead your ship. With BFT, obviously, which is more what you're going to be taking for your main batteries, but it obviously has a side benefit with your AA, that then jumps up to 108, which is not bad for tier 5. You also, with AFT, are able to push out your outer envelope from 4 kilometers to 4.8 kilometers, which again is not bad for tier 5. And the only ship that does actually really benefit from AFT and BFT in terms of the AA at this tier, and manual AA, is surprisingly the Kirov. I was a little bit nonplussed to see it was that. The Bartin also has probably, I think, the second best, in fact maybe overall the best AA, but it gets less benefit from manual AA. But yeah, if you went into a manual AA build on the Kirov, it is actually surprisingly good, because you can have a 6 kilometer outer envelope with a maximum possible of 162 DPS. So that's pretty respectable. So, the AA is not completely terrible is what I'm saying. You will maybe shoot down some planes. You'll note there was actually 2 carriers in this game, and I did get some plane kills. But, yeah, it's not going to save you. Tier 6 is the tier where AA really does kick in. And of all the lower tiers, the Texas is really the only one that has any kind of level of formidable anti-aircraft armament. You've got 3 kilometer, not 3 kilometer torpedoes, well, 5 kilometer torpedoes is right, but 2x3 launchers is what I was trying to say there, and this happens to fortuitously occur just when I'm launching torpedoes in the replay itself. They're not super powerful. You do 13,200, assuming that you don't hit on the belt, that they take the full amount of damage. As I've said, they are 5 kilometers, which is not completely terrible for this tier, but it's still almost the worst. Only the Kirov has a worse range. They are reasonably fast though. 65 knots is alright. They also have a reload time of 1 minute 10, which again is okay. That's towards the faster end of this tier. And they have a detection range of 1.3 kilometers, which again is actually quite decent. They're not super, they're not going to broadcast their presence coming from miles and miles away, but again, they're not really super sneaky. I think it's either going to be the Marblehead or the Omaha that has the sneakiest torps, but they're also much slower torps on the US cruisers. Speed-wise, it's the slowest cruiser at Tier 5, 29 knots. You will feel that. Put on your Sierra Mike flags, definitely. But even so, yeah, this is no speed demon. And it's one of the things that does, like, even with a good captain, it's one of the things that does make this ship a bit lackluster. It's not particularly great in terms of just that it can't go very fast. It does make a difference. And 25 knots versus, say, 32 or 33 knots doesn't sound like a huge difference, but it kind of is. It does add up. Your turning radius, 590 meters, which is, I think, joint best. Yes, joint best with the Murmansk. And so it is reasonably maneuverable in the water, but unlike the Murmansk, unlike the Omaha, and also the Marblehead, you don't get a really nice rudder shift response to go with it. It's a much more average 7.2 seconds. In fact, it's actually worse than average. The average is 6.3 for this tier. I've actually got nice columns on my spreadsheet, and some of them have got averages drawn out across the, because I'm sad like that. So, yeah, 7.2 is okay. It's the turning radius is pretty good. If it had something closer to the Omaha's 5.7 or even the Murmansk's amazing 3.8. It would feel maybe really nice. If I was going to buff one thing about this cruiser as is, I would make it maybe either handle better in the water or else make it a bit faster. Although I'm guessing if you made it faster, that would probably be not particularly historically accurate, but there you go. Lastly, we come on to how sneaky it is, but first we'll actually take a quick look at the scorecard for this first game. So bearing in mind this was without IFHE in a tier 7 game, and me basically trying to use cover where I could, to do damage where I could, and to be sneaky, but although I was fairly high up on the team list, it's not like it was a fantastic damage result. It's because I was doing damage to higher tier ships, basically. And as you can see there, yeah, 97 shots fired for 25,500 damage. I had about 9,500 from the 3 fires I set as well. Bear that in mind. Bear that in mind when you watch the next replay and see the next scorecard and how much more damage I was able to do with IFHE. And it'll highlight the importance of that particular skill. So it wasn't a bad result, but like any tier 5 cruiser bottom tier, you are kind of just scrabbling around, trying not to get focused too much and just doing damage where you can. So it isn't really any different in that regard. It's just all of the other tier 5 cruisers will do what it does, but, you know, faster because it's quite slow. So, anyway, surface detection 13.7 without camo, but obviously you're going to be using the camo because it's a premium ship. So with that, it's 13.3, which is not that good. It's not the worst, but it's definitely far from the best, and it's something that, you know, like if you could somehow also fit all those skills that you need and concealment expert on this, that would also be a really good skill to have, because with concealment expert you could get it down to 11.6, which is much more comfortable than 13.3. But alas, I think you're probably just going to have to live with the 13.3 because there's just no way you can fit concealment expert in there. It's just so vital to have all those other skills for this to be any good as a damage dealer. As I said, you could maybe give up IFHE, but you would be giving up so much damage potential in this, and you could maybe give up the range and live with the not very good 14 kilometers. But then you're going to be struggling to stay alive because you're going to be that much closer to the enemy. And given that you're going to be bottom tier so much, that extra range equals extra reaction time to incoming shots, and that equals staying alive longer and doing damage for longer over the course of the game. So it would be really nice to have concealment expert, but I just think it's a necessary sacrifice to not have it. Other people might disagree with me, but in this case, yeah, it's kind of an easy choice, all things considered. The air detection is 6 kilometers, and the detection when you're firing from smoke is 6.9. That firing from smoke detection, that actually feels on the high side to me, to be honest, considering the caliber of the guns. The lowest at the tier is the Emerald with 5.4, but that, you know, like the Emerald doesn't have a lot going for it, so considering that the Emerald does rely on laying its own smoke and just not getting shot ever at all, it feels fair enough that that has the lowest smoke detection. But nearly 7 kilometers firing from smoke, considering it's the 130mm guns. The Emil Bartan gets 6.2 with 6-inch guns. The Omaha has 6.9 with 6-inch guns. Veritaka has 6.9 with 8-inch guns. And the only one that's actually worse than 6.9 is the Kirov, which has 8-inch guns. And I've not gone through the cruisers comprehensively from start to finish across all tiers and looked at that smoke detection stat. Maybe this is part of the flavour that they've added for Soviet cruisers, is that they have not very good smoke detection as a surface spotting radius, but it feels harsh for this particular ship just because you've got that smaller caliber of guns. And when you compare it to the 8-inch guns for attacker having exactly the same debuff when you're firing from smoke, yeah, that doesn't feel so good. So again, maybe that's a thing that could be buffed. So that's just about it. I mean, as you can see, it has Hydro as its only consumable on top of the damage control party, so there's nothing really to cover there. It's just standard Hydro. And, well, that leaves me now free to talk about some actual gameplay. So once again, bottom tier, once again, an aircraft carrier, but only a single aircraft carrier per side this time, to tier 6 on each side. And it is in fact the same map as well, although last time it was domination, this time it's a standard game, which does rather change the nature of things. So again, I've been being circumspect, I've been trying to use that range to my advantage, but yeah, as I noted before, the relatively slow speed of these shells, which makes it play a lot more like a US cruiser, albeit with a pretty good range, means that for firing at enemy cruisers, firing at enemy destroyers, they do have a fairly decent reaction time. So actually finding the range and hitting the targets at those longer ranges can be quite difficult. But if you're at relatively close ranges, then yeah, it's really not too difficult, all things considered. So I'm here with a couple of allies. I'm trying to use this island ahead of me to limit what could possibly fire at me, but I've noted that there is also a Fuso in the middle as well, which would be nasty, but they're actually occupied with the Gnevny that's right in their face at the moment. So I'm considering switching fire to that, but at the moment it seems like it's a good idea to maybe try and take down that Degrasser as much as possible. But now the Degrasser is retreating out of my line of fire, you know, they're really trying to get away and get unspotted. Suddenly taking on this Fuso does seem like much more of a priority. Now the Gnevny, I think it was Gnevny that was there, has died, but it's not just me firing at him. There's an Algerie behind me, there's also a destroyer there as well, a Gerda, there's a Queen Elizabeth which doesn't have shots yet but might do eventually, and well, he's just not concentrating on me at the moment at all. So, oh yes, that's an island, don't run into the island. So I feel relatively confident firing at him at the moment, but even if I wasn't, he is within detection range. So it's not like I could stop firing and stealth up without actually getting some extra distance. So only 17, almost 18k damage done so far, but I can tell you now it's going to be a much better damage game than previously. Nothing spectacular, but given that it's a similar-ish set of circumstances to the previous game, it's going to be a rather better damage result, and a big part of that will come from the fact that it's IFHE I'm using. And to some extent, you know, having said this needs its own captain, a lot of the captain skills are relevant on Soviet destroyers, and if you had a pure gunboat build for a Soviet destroyer that had all of the captain skills that I have outlined, then you could probably put that captain in this instead. But there might be some skills that don't quite overlap. There might be some skills that you would prefer to have on a Soviet destroyer, like for instance Concealment Expert, which I don't know. I haven't gotten to the high tiers of Soviet destroyers, so I am absolutely no expert on on which captain skills are the most relevant, but Concealment Expert still seems like it would be useful even if you're playing a very gunboaty build. But yeah, for most people it might be the case that they just need a separate captain, which is certainly the case for me, because I have played up to tier 6 of the Soviet destroyers, but on the NA server, and this is all on the EU server. I didn't rush to buy myself a Krasny Krim on the NA server. Having one was quite frankly enough. So we've had somebody take notice of me for the first time, but I was able to, well, not actually not for the first time, I have lost a bit of health already, but yeah, I was able to dodge those shells. I was able to react in time quite comfortably, and I've now also got the benefit of this island between us, so I am still air spotted. They could still try and aim at me, but it would maybe not be quite as easy to do so. That Fuso's still alive, by the way, but we're hopefully going to take him down fairly soon, and well, if we can deal with him and the KGV, that is a significant chunk of the enemy's firepower dealt with. So that'll be rather nice. I'm going to keep playing it cautious, though. I'm going to let the Queen Elizabeth take the hits, because, you know, the Queen Elizabeth can take the hits. And if that KGV is firing the British HE at me, it could easily pen. It could easily pen in the Citadel, because the KGV, especially when you're firing your HE at tier 5 cruisers, most of them don't have enough armour to resist, even with the Citadel protection. And so you can get HE Citadels and, you know, do all kinds of criticals and set all kinds of fires, and it's just generally very nasty. So it looks like the Fuso, oh there we go, the Fuso's just gone down. The Queen Elizabeth was focusing the low health battleship, which is good. Queen Elizabeth is trying to, King George V rather, is trying to get into cover, and that leaves me closer, free rather, to advance closer. And it really does look like we've got the enemy team on the ropes at this point. But, you know, we can't get too cocky. We are pretty much equal on numbers right now. But if we take out the KGV, that will tip things a bit in our favour. I got fewer plane kills in this one, by the way. I think there were just more planes flying overhead in the first one. But also, you know, with AA, there's always that element of RNG. You just don't know how it's going to go in terms of shooting down planes, because Wargaming loves their RNG. Hell, you know, fires as well. I've actually already gotten one more fire than the previous replay, even though this time round I've got IFHE, which actually slightly lowers my fire chance. And again, it's just RNG. So a Graf Spee, a cruiser with cruiser armour, which is very nice for my IFHE, potentially, although they're not really giving me any broadsides. You're going to be mostly firing HE in this, especially if you've got an IFHE as a captain skill. There will be times when the AP is appropriate if you're reasonably close range and you've got a cruiser giving you a nice tasty broadside. But for the most part, yeah, it's going to be HE all the way. There's not a huge amount of choice with this particular ship. So rather than go forward and be shot at by two cruisers, I'm actually going to duck in behind this island and wait for the Nelson and the Queen Elizabeth to catch up a little bit. They've run out of battleships at this point. They do have a mast that's chasing our own carrier, but otherwise it is just these two cruisers. And there we can see the Enterprise. Enterprise? No, not the Enterprise. Independence has been spotted lurking behind that island. No, the Enterprise is a very different ship. Completely different ship. So I've jumped ahead a little bit. I'm going to sneak forward and just secure the kill on that Graf Spee. And heck, I might even be able to do the same thing on the De Grasser. RNG's as willing. But, as it's going to turn out, no. I had only one pen and one shatter out of that salvo. So there's the Independence. He might send his planes after me. We'll see, you know, what he has left at this stage of the game. I don't know if we had any particularly AA ships in this one, although the Queen Elizabeth, if it's set up right, can be an absolute AA monster. People do not appreciate that about the Queen Elizabeth, which is quite funny when I'm playing one. Next to the Cleveland, it has the best AA at tier 6, pretty much. And it's all in the long-range DPS, and it does heavily rely on having manual AA as a skill. But yeah, it's hilarious when you get the opportunity to use it. So the Independence is being very unsporting and has gone around the other side of the island, which puts them now square in the line of fire of the Queen Elizabeth and probably the Nelson from that angle as well, just about. Which obviously, you know, that's just not on. They should have just sat where they were and let me farm their hit points, and instead they're going to give their hit points to other people. So that's not cricket, honestly. It's just not. It's just not. I might get to do a bit more damage here. We'll see. I'm not entirely sure what the Independence was thinking. I think it was just, oh dear, I'm being shot, I'd better go forwards. But it's not like it's going to stop them getting shot going forwards. They're just, you know, dying all the quicker to battleship guns. So I'm actually going to try some AP here. I might get lucky, but no. It's actually the Queen Elizabeth that gets a fire from... I don't know if they were shooting HE or if that was secondaries. It might have been secondaries at that range. that set afire. But either way, that's basically it for this game. The Mars was maybe going for our cap, which is why we got in the enemy cap, but we were going to win on points with the timer going down anyway. And as it turned out, the cruiser that was down there, the Budioni that was chasing after the mast, got the kill literally seconds before the game ended. So he did actually manage to kill the enemy team. So 69,000 damage. That was about double. In fact, I think over double the damage done last time. A little higher up the team list. I think roughly the same amount of XP, though. I can't remember what it was for the last game, but 1400 base XP being bottom tier is not half bad. And then we can see that I did more damage with fires this time, 17k versus less than 10k, but also a lot more damage with the shells, 140 hits for 49, almost 50,000 damage. So the IFHE does make a difference. It really is quite a useful skill. And as this is a premium, I mean, I haven't even talked about its credit gain or anything like that, but as it's a premium, obviously you're going to make okay credits with it, but it's a tier 5 premium, so that effect is somewhat limited. So, on to the conclusion. Would I recommend this as a premium ship? No, not really. If you were seriously after a tier 5 cruiser that's useful for training up other Soviet cruiser captains, then the Murmansk is still vastly superior to this, and even the Murmansk does kind of struggle these days at tier 5, but it's still superior. There's no question about it. As, however, something that's a little bit different and a little bit more interesting, and something that has a bit of novelty value to it, then yeah, the Krasny Krim is okay. Without the captain skills I've mentioned, it's not very good. It really isn't. And with the captain skills, that's where it starts to become a bit more interesting. But for a lot of people, unless you're willing to do a lot of grinding with a captain that doesn't have those skills yet, or else repurpose an existing high-skill captain to put in what is essentially, not that great premium ship, it's a bit of an ask, as the expression goes. Most people aren't going to be willing to do that, to put that much time into grinding a captain for a tier 5 cruiser to get the best out of it. So it is absolutely a novelty. As a serious premium ship, I cannot recommend this, but as a novelty, if you have a captain you're willing to dedicate to it, then it's okay. It's not completely horrible. It does have some interest to it. And some premiums are like that. Some premiums, they're not necessarily great ships on their own, but there's something about them that makes them a bit interesting, a bit different, and it gives you a bit of variety of play. And in this case, it pretty much comes down to the range, having AFT. And the other captain skills kind of come after that point. But once you've got that 16.8 kilometers, it gives you quite a nice cushion against being down-tiered. So in some ways, I'm more willing to play this as a tier 5 cruiser than any of the other tier 5 cruisers I've got, just because I know I have that extra range. But, it's not all gravy, because then you have that extra shell flight time, and it is quite a long flight time. So that's it for this review. Hopefully you found it useful or interesting or just, something. And if you have, you can leave any comments below. You can hit the like button. You can sub to my channel if you haven't already. And, as always, stay tuned for more.